So let's talk about marijuana. So it's most commonly abused psychoactive substance. We often talk about THC like that's all there is in marijuana. It's not. There's a lot of different ways that people take it. So everyone knows that you can smoke it, but increasingly people are vaporing it. They actually call this stealth vaping. So don't assume that just because someone is using a vaporized e-cigarette that there's necessarily nicotine or tobacco-related products in that. There are actually ways that people are diluting this stuff down with organic solvents to make it so that they can vape. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, it doesn't really smell like marijuana because a lot of the stuff that's in there, if they're using synthetic chemicals, don't have that classic pot odor to it. Okay, so you wouldn't really know, especially if they have, as is common, flavors on it. Okay, so if you see someone and they're acting really weird and they're using one of those e-cigarettes, it may not be the case that they're actually using it for nicotine. Okay, and then of course ingesting, because it turns out that a lot of the oils that you can get from this plant can be put in butter, and that's why they always have baked goods that are kind of fatty. Okay, you're less likely, to have like kale spread or something like that that's made out of this, as you are like cookies and brownies because they have lots of butter, and that has its own problems. Because it turns out your average pothead knows exactly what happens if they smoke a joint of certain size. You have no idea how much of this stuff is in something if you eat, say, a brownie or a cookie. Okay, and they're actually running into this problem where they have made it legal to buy it recreationally. Because people think when you buy a cookie at Subway, they want me to eat the whole cookie. Okay, they don't assume, there's lots of weird things about FDA labeling of, oh, you buy a cookie, that's 5 servings. And that's how they get to like, oh, there's only 8 grams of fat per serving. It's garbage. You're eating the whole cookie. Like no one buys a cookie and eats half of it. I don't trust that guy, okay? But the problem is a lot of these things have enough THC in them to where they're selling a cookie and it's supposed to be like enough to make 8 people high. So it's a real problem because then people eat the whole cookie. And if you ingest it, there's actually a delayed effect, okay? So if you smoke it, it happens fairly quickly within the next 10 to 15 minutes. If you ingest it, sometimes the effect is delayed for 1 or 2 hours. So what happens? People buy plane tickets to Colorado. They go out there, they buy a pot brownie, okay? And they buy a big one because, hey, we got on a plane to get here. And they start eating that pot brownie and nothing happens. And so they eat some more, nothing happens. They eat some more, nothing happens. And then an hour and a half later, they get higher than anyone should ever be. And it's really, really dangerous for them because that almost never ends well, okay? And it's because that dose-related response that people have found over time of, I smoke a joint and this is what happens, isn't there because of that time lag. So what are the problems with marijuana? They're actually highly debated, okay? So it's associated with early psychosis. A lot of these folks may have been at high risk for psychosis anyway. So we don't know. It turns out that if you smoke pot, you're more likely to be diagnosed with things like schizophrenia earlier in life. That is established. The question is, were those same folks the people that were at high risk anyway? Okay, and that we don't know. We just don't. It's association, not causation, okay? It definitely impairs your short-term cognition over the course of 1 to 2 weeks, somewhere in that area, okay? So pot does make you dumb. It's not clear if pot makes you dumb permanently. They just don't know, okay? And partially because they don't have long-term studies. It's certainly the case that if you smoke a lot of weed, you're probably not going to go hit the textbooks particularly hard, and so that might be part of why you're dumb, but even on cognitive assessments, you're actually slower. The same is the case for alcohol. I'm sure no one in this room has ever drank too much alcohol, but have you noticed in like the next week or two, like you're not quite as sharp as you were. So it's not just a problem that if you abuse alcohol that you're a problem if you show up drunk to a shift. If you're abusing alcohol, you're really not as good of a clinician as you could be for the next few weeks as your body tries to recover from that. There's the coming up like cyclic vomiting syndrome. Y'all have read Larry Mellick's emails. I'm not going to belabor that more. It's also unclear if it's associated with lung cancer. There don't seem to have as much evidence that if you smoke pot, you're at higher risk than people that don't smoke cigarettes. But there is some emerging data that if you smoke both pot and cigarettes, you have a higher risk of lung cancer than if you just smoke cigarettes. That's weak associative data because the people that do that tend to smoke a lot more in general. But it is a little bit of a thing to make you pause that it may not be quite as healthy. And one of the major concerns is the risk of DUI for people that smoke pot. That if they're under the influence of this, it's harder to test this at the roadside than, say, a breathalyzer. And this is actually one of the biggest things that law enforcement brings up about how it's dangerous, okay? It turns out that people that are on marijuana tend to drive slower, but their reaction times are really, really slow. So they tend not to get into the catastrophic accidents that other people do, but they're still crashing a lot, and it certainly isn't safe. It's probably more or less on the same layer of risk as driving drunk. Okay, that goes back and forth about which is worse. Should someone be stoned or drunk while driving? The answer is obviously none of the above.